welcome back to our weekly installment of the Vietnam War History 3322. As I said before, an Emmy Award-winning show. All right, last time we actually began talking about Vietnam at home, and we will continue with that today. Normally in a course on the war, you might not expect to get so much what would be considered domestic history, but you can't do Vietnam, you can't adequately discuss Vietnam without going into some depth about what was happening at home because, well, in any case, wars are going to fundamentally transform societies. If you look at the major wars in this century, World War I, World War II, of course, they had an impact beyond what was happening in the battlefields of Europe. They affected America very deeply. They were the main causes of economic transformation. In World War I, the U.S. went from being a debtor to a creditor nation because it was bankrolling the British and French. World War II, of course, we're now familiar with. The United States emerges from World War II as the great superpower, the only superpower that the world had. It emerges as a massive economic power, controlling 50% of the world's trade because other places were destroyed and the United States actually improved during the war because industry was able to work 3 shifts, 7 days a week. It's 24/7, and the United States after World War II was afraid of a repeat of the 1930s and the depressions of that period, so it creates a new world order. So war is fundamentally transformed, not just what's happening in the field and the countries at war, but the home front as well. In World War II, for instance, the hypocrisy of fighting against Nazis who violate human rights and the treatment of blacks in the United States becomes quite pronounced. And so in the 1940s and 50s, this gives rise to an invigorated civil rights movement who says, if we can fight for democracy in Europe against Hitler, then why can't we have it here at home? Same thing happens after World War I. People like Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey and others. Vietnam is clearly a case of that. Vietnam, even though, as I mentioned last week, all wars had dissent against them, World War II being mostly exceptional in that regard. Vietnam had a pronounced, huge, and public anti-war movement, which received a lot of media attention and I think had a role to play in the politics of the period. Vietnam also affected, which is what we'll get to after this, what was happening at home at the time. Lyndon Johnson's attempt to create a great society, to wage a war on poverty. Vietnam takes stage at a time when America's youth, especially on college campuses, are demanding participatory democracy. And this demand for accountability from its leaders becomes a demand to end the war in Vietnam. Vietnam occurs at a time when, as I just mentioned, the civil rights movement was flowering and achieving its greatest successes. And Vietnam occurs when that movement reaches its heights and has a huge impact on making the movement stagnant. The civil rights movement after 1964 and 1965 essentially fragments and never has that kind of success again. And as the leading spokesman of the time, Martin Luther King, pointed out, Vietnam had a huge role to play in that process, as the amazingly powerful speech in your reader, which should be standard reading, I think, for anybody. Any citizen should read that speech. Points out Vietnam and the anti-war movement helped give rise to a women's movement and a counterculture. You talk about things like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and you think these are hedonistic individualist things, but in fact, I will argue they have a political basis to them. Okay, so last week we began talking about this. Maybe if I hit previous instead of next, that would be a good thing. There is a difference. Okay. Last week we started talking about anti-war activism and talked about the roots of it and things like the Ban the Bond movement, Insane, and the beatniks and the cafes. And I talked about the origins of teach-ins, which began in 1965 first in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan, and then they spread nationally, and they encompassed many different components of society. The initial opposition to the war occurred at a fairly rarefied level on campuses among intellectuals. Most people, polls show fairly significant support for the war, and that will continue really throughout most of this period, which we'll talk about when we get to the media and the war, which really is contrary to typical ideas. The media stabbed us in the back and so forth. In fact, up to that, the media was pretty supportive, very supportive, in fact, of the war in Vietnam. So in 1965, you don't have much media critique of the war in Vietnam. Public opinion polls show Americans really overwhelmingly supportive of the war, which is something else you're going to see throughout this entire period. Those who question it tend to do so at the university level, through these teach-ins, through public rallies, which are fairly well attended considering how little is known about Vietnam. For instance, the first rally SDS has in D.C. in April of '65 is attended by over 25,000 people, and they were hoping for a turnout of about 10,000. Now compared to numbers later where you might have 200,000 at a march on the Pentagon or 1 million participating in the moratorium or the mobilization to end the war, 25,000 isn't much. But in 1965, considering the consensus in favor of the war, considering the general mood in the country, which was quite high, I mean, America was quite on a high in 1965. The economy was strong, civil rights legislation was moving, Johnson had just achieved a fantastic electoral victory in '64, you know, a stunning victory for the Democratic Party. I mean, 1965 was, you know, kind of really good times for the United States. So the fact that any Americans were critical of Vietnam should be somewhat surprising, but it did occur at a fairly rarefied level. At that level, there's one individual I'd like to talk about a bit, not too much, who I think really stands out. And I think the New York Times once referred to him as the most important intellectual of our time. He is, among living authors, the most cited man, and in terms of citations worldwide, is just behind Plato and Freud. That's Noam Chomsky, who's a linguist, a professor of philosophy and linguistics at MIT, and Chomsky's still around today. He is, I think, the world's most important dissident. And Chomsky was known as a great linguist in the 1950s. He developed the theory that language is actually innate, it's inherent. You're hardwired for language. It's not necessarily taught or educated. You have facility for language which is intuitive. And this really kind of shattered the whole field of cognitive thinking. He was also an outspoken political radical. He was a champion of the underdog and remains so today. And he really emerged as an international intellectual in the Vietnam period. At the time, he was writing for two fairly new publications, especially Ramparts, which was a radical magazine, and the New York Review of Books, which was first published, I think, around 1967, 66, 67, somewhere around there. Nowadays, that tends to focus on things like literary criticism, but it had a clear political bent to it when it first came out. And Chomsky, especially in things like the New York Review of Books and Ramparts, really emerged as a leading spokesman against the war. And what Chomsky did, more than simply talk about the war in Vietnam, which other people like Gabriel Kogel and William Allen Williams and Hans Morgenthau were doing, was put it in a much larger context. Chomsky puts Vietnam in the context of the Cold War, in the context of American political culture, in the context of capitalism. He also talks about people who support the war as being part of a particular culture. And this, I think, is really kind of one of the more important points of the Chomskyan critique that is worth mentioning. He wrote several essays, you know, an unimaginable amount of writing in the 1960s, and he continues to be that prolific today. But around 1969 or 70, he put out a publication, a collection of many of his writings called American Power and the New Mandarins. And in it, one essay really stood out. I think it's the most important one of this entire period. It was called The Responsibility of Intellectuals. And Chomsky talks about the way that the government and the media and the universities all work together to create a consensus on major national issues. This is, in a sense, an elaboration on the kind of ideas that, for example, Eisenhower would have brought out when he talked about the military-industrial complex and the university's role in it. And so Chomsky, in The Responsibility of Intellectuals, talks about how Vietnam became a national issue. In a sense, it was just kind of snuck in there because the government did it without input, and the kind of scribbling and chattering classes, the media, reporters, newsmen, intellectuals, all went along with it because it was in their interest to do so. So Chomsky attacks political and academic apologists for the war in very strict terms. He says, intellectuals are in a position to expose the lies of government, to analyze actions according to their causes and motives and often hidden intentions. He says, it is the responsibility of intellectuals to speak the truth and to expose lies. Reminds me of the old populist slogan, we should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. All right? Chomsky takes particular aim then at those who defend the war. And it's kind of funny because in retrospect now, in the 1980s and 1990s, one political attack that has often worked is claiming that the Democrats or liberals were soft on communism or soft on defense or somehow cowardly, if not traitors outright. And it's quite ironic because this is very much, as I pointed out many times, a liberals' war. It is a Democratic Party liberals' war. Vietnam is. It is part of the bigger liberal agenda. World markets, world trade, hegemony. And so Chomsky is taking to particular task those people who have made this possible by essentially creating a consensus by not allowing the people to have the information they need. He will later use Walter Lippmann's phrase, the manufacture of consent, to talk about this, manufacturing consent. The idea that we can't tell the people everything they need to know because they might oppose policies which we think are in the best interests of whoever needs to be taken care of. So we need to manufacture a consent among them. Chomsky is often given credit for this phrase, but in fact it was the good liberal, Walter Lippmann, who created it. Lippmann basically was contemptuous of the people. He just didn't think that they had the necessary intelligence to figure out what was best for the United States. So they essentially had to be manufactured. It had to be manufactured. And this is what's happening in the Vietnam era. So America's educated elite, despite claims that radicals have taken over the campus, despite claims that Marxists are all the professors are Marxist, all the kind of old things you've heard and continue to hear from people like Newt Gingrich or Phil Gramm or others. Chomsky points out that most intellectuals, in fact, supported the war. They bought into it, and that this was not an aberration, but this was, in fact, a systemic condition, that in the United States there really wasn't an oppositional class as you might have in Europe. In Europe, you have a wider political spectrum. You'll have socialist or laborites. You'll have university radicals. You will have Marxists. It's okay to be a Marxist in Europe, whereas in the United States, very few professors in the 1960s, even though they were called out by others, would ever call themselves a Marxist or a radical. These terms just weren't generally in use. And in fact, among the worst red baiters were the liberals, people like Arthur Schlesinger and Johnson and his people. Johnson basically branded anyone who opposed the war a communist or a dupe of the communist. He would have the FBI and CIA infiltrate the anti-war movement to see if they were getting directions from Hanoi or Beijing, as if Khrushchev or Brezhnev or Mao have nothing better to do than to send a telegram to Tom Hayden. This is kind of the level at which they're operating. So the liberals are as bad as anybody on this, and Chomsky points this out. And he concludes with words which I, as a professor, found very powerful. The question, what have I done, is one that we may well ask ourselves as we read each day of fresh atrocities in Vietnam, as we create or mouth or tolerate the deceptions that will be used to justify the next defense of freedom. So Chomsky is basically saying to the intellectuals of the United States, to the educators and to the students, it is up to you to call the government on this activity. Okay? No one else is going to do it. You cannot count on the media or the professors to do it. We're going to have to do it on our own. It's going to take a movement of the people, students, interested professors, and whatnot. But as intellectuals, you have a certain responsibility to do it. Right? So Chomsky, I think, really becomes a beacon for many others, and no one individual is responsible for the anti-war movement. It did not have leaders. The beauty of it, in fact, was that it was so decentralized, if not anarchic at times. But I think in terms of being a kind of an inspiration, Chomsky is probably as important as anybody in that period. You talk even today to people of that generation who were active in the movement, and quite often Chomsky's name will come out, and his essays like The Responsibility of Intellectuals are still cited today quite frequently as having a huge impact on people within the movement. Others, using Chomsky as an example, did, as the phrase of the day went, speak truth to power. It was a quite common phrase, speak truth to power. David Dellinger and David McReynolds, who were old leftists and pacifists, become leaders in the anti-war movement. Two of the better known were brothers who were Jesuit priests, the Berrigans, Philip and Daniel Berrigan. And beyond simply talking about the war, the Berrigan brothers took direct action. They counseled young men on avoiding military service. They encouraged them to burn their draft cards. And the Berrigans themselves were arrested and convicted for destroying records. They went into a selective service office in Catonsville, Maryland, and they took all the selective service records and they destroyed them. And then they stood there and waited to get arrested. It was civil disobedience, the kind of thing Martin Luther King was doing. You don't commit an act like that and run. You take the punishment for it. The Catonsville nine people did it, where it became quite famous in the anti-war movement. Young men would regularly just sit on stand on the steps of the local, courthouse or the selective service office and burn their draft cards and essentially dare the authorities to arrest them. Hans Morgenthau, one of the more intriguing characters in this, is actually Hans Morgenthau. Morgenthau was an old favorite of the Washington establishment. There are always kind of in-house intellectuals Nowadays, you have people like John Gaddis who are, the subject of front page articles in the newest U.S. News and World Report. It says something about John Gaddis and the Cold War. You can always find an intellectual to be on CNN or to be on Nightline, giving the expert opinion, which almost always conforms to what the powers that be want you to hear. And Morgenthau had served that function. He was kind of the guy who was quoted by Walter Lippmann and others. Morgenthau was the guy who could say, yes, the U.S. is taking the right approach in the Cold War because yada, yada, yada. Well, when it comes to Vietnam, Morgenthau switches gears. He, like Chomsky, blasts the intellectual community. He accuses them of political opportunism. And he says in incredibly stark terms, incredibly powerful terms, Morgenthau says, the intellectuals of America have indeed been raped, but many of them have looked forward to the experience and are enjoying it. So, I mean, Chomsky and Morgenthau become pariahs among their peers. They are considered wild-haired, crazy, irresponsible intellectuals. They're not responsible. This is the term you often hear. They're not acting responsibly because of this rhetoric. But in fact, to generations of younger people and young professors and people concerned with peace and justice issues, they really do become icons. They become heroes, all right? At the same time, I don't want to overstress what their role is, because this was not a centralized movement with recognizable leaders. I mean, the civil rights movement, in a sense, with King was. King was clearly the central figure in that movement. And when he dies, there is no one who has the magnitude that King ever did. The anti-war movement wasn't like that. I mean, I happen to talk about Chomsky in very strong terms, but I would not disagree with somebody who would talk about Tom Hayden in very strong terms, or Carl Oglesby, or Paul Potter, people whose names really aren't that familiar, because there was no anti-war movement singular to speak of. There were a lot of movements and a lot of people involved. I think Chomsky is very important, though, for the kind of inspiration and the principles he espoused. The heart of the movement, though, I would agree, is not at the top, it's in the streets. And when you talk about the anti-war movement, the hero, if you are inclined to believe there are heroes, or if you agree with that, would be the typical demonstrator. It would not be a Martin Luther King figure. I mean, when you talk, there are plenty of heroes in the civil rights movement as well, Rosa Parks and Goodman, Cheney and Schwerner and whatnot, but you tend to see King as the centerpiece of all this. In the anti-war movement, there's nothing like that. And the heart of the movement is in the streets. Demonstrations in major cities continued and grew throughout 1966 and 67 as more American soldiers, as more American boys went to Vietnam. They included millions of Americans of all ages, groups, religions, and classes. I think in the earliest years, and again, it's real hard to get straight demographic evidence, but if you look at it in terms of, look at photos from major demos, most protesters are going to be fairly young. They're going to be students in the earliest years, 66 and 67, or veterans of like the Ban the Bomb movement or civil rights movement. There's a great deal of crossover. It's like a conveyor belt between civil rights and anti-war. So you're going to have a lot of people who maybe got started in civil rights and then will shift to the anti-war movement. And in fact, this will become more common because after 1965, which I'll talk about later, the civil rights movement becomes somewhat fragmented, and a black nationalist movement emerges, and whites are less welcome in many of the groups that had been very instrumental in the period below that. So in a lot of cases, Caucasians will bolt civil rights and become anti-war activists. Other groups, which had started for other issues, will become anti-war groups. So you start to see kind of some greater diversity. But for the most part, it's still a fairly young movement, and it's strongest on college campuses. All right. So in 1967, in April, for example, anywhere between 125,000 and 400,000 people protested the war in New York. If you've ever been to a demonstration, it would be fantastic for somebody to study the politics of the National Park Service counting. You go to a rally, and the sponsors of the rally will claim that there were 300,000 people there, and the Park Service will say 75,000. I know when I lived in Washington, D.C., I would often be downtown, and you couldn't move. The place would be jammed with people, and the Park Service would say there were 50,000 people there. Now, maybe there weren't 300,000, but clearly there's a political point to all this. We want to make sure, if we're the government, that only a few people are protesting the war, and if you're the sponsors, you want to say, no, everybody's with us. And so whenever you see rallies in the 60s, the numbers are going to be all over the place. But in April of 1967, between 75,000, which was the official figure, and 400,000, which was the sponsors' figure, protest the war in New York, I think in Central Park. 75,000 protest the war on that same day in San Francisco. So the movement isn't just national protest in Washington, D.C. They are all over. Now, of course, big cities, Boston, which of course is going to be fairly liberal. New York, San Francisco, none of these places are surprising, will have large anti-war rallies. Now, the movement was also evolving, and this will turn off a lot of people. There's always, again, to speak of the anti-war movement singular is really useless, because there are many different movements, and in fact, there is a great deal of fragmentation in the movement. The initial movement included, as I said, college students, but also old-line pacifists, veterans of like the Ban the Bond movement or the Civil Rights movement. And many of these people actually were very, they weren't mainstream or establishment, they were very proper though. It wasn't at all unusual to see a lot of people in suits and ties at anti-war movements, and the speeches would focus on the idea that somehow Vietnam was un-American or it was unnatural, it was morally wrong. Now, you start to see in 1966 and 67 different types of people come into the movement, and many of them are far more militant. And they will start not only to talk about, you know, Vietnam being wrong, but Vietnam being systemic. And rather than just oppose the war, many of these people might go beyond that and, for example, carry a Viet Cong flag in the rally, or openly hope that the Vietnamese win the war, or chant, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Or ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, NLF is going to win. So you'll start to see stuff that really kind of makes some of the older folks, or the more, I guess conservative would be a fair term, folks, very uncomfortable. All right? And nobody makes people more uncomfortable, the older folks more uncomfortable, and are more lionized by the younger folks than Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. And again, you could look at them as stalwarts of the movement, and I wouldn't disagree with that. Hoffman and Rubin, as I say, were part Karl Marx and part Groucho Marx. They were really the crown princes of the movement. And what they did was take something that was quite serious, I mean, deadly serious, it's war, right? And turn it into guerrilla theater as well. And they spoke not only to the opposition to the war, but to the emerging youth culture, which I will talk about later. Jerry Rubin once went to a committee meeting in Washington, D.C. in the House of Representatives dressed as George Washington with a powdered wig. One of my favorite Rubin and Hoffman antics was they went to Wall Street, to the stock exchange, where, you know, in the pit, traders are working at the time with hundreds of thousands of dollars. The market wasn't even at 1,000 yet. And they got a stack of like 50 $1 bills and threw it down there. And all these traders are beating each other up to get at these ones. They're trading hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they're scrambling to get a dollar bill. And Hoffman and Rubin thought that was a beautiful statement on the system, that all these guys who are, you know, very well-to-do, trading huge amounts of money, are going to beat each other up for a dollar bill. It's like, you know, ruining a suit to get a $2 baseball that comes into the stands at a baseball game. In their perhaps greatest moment, Rubin and Hoffman and many others, including the poet Allen Ginsberg, the folk protest singer Phil Oakes, Country Joe McDonald and the Fish, Ed Sanders and the Fugs, all put together a new group called the Yippies, the Youth International Party, or Yippies. And the Yippies were never a minority, but they got more media attention than any other anti-war group. This was the kind of theatrical fringe of the movement. Country Joe, Phil Oakes, Hoffman, and Rubin. They organized, I think, in early 1968, and their major goal that year was to go to Chicago. 1968 was the year when the Democrats were going to have their national convention in Chicago, Illinois. Right? Until March, kind of getting ahead of the game a bit, it looked as though LBJ would be nominated for re-election. However, because of the Tet Offensive, which we will talk about later, Johnson pulls out of the race, and his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, will become the nominee. And Humphrey never really distanced himself from LBJ until it was too late. He was tainted with the war, and there was other stuff going on as well, the candidacies of first Eugene McCarthy and then Bobby Kennedy, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and then Bobby Kennedy. So the country's on edge. It's a bad year. I mean, I was fairly young, but 68 was a bad year. I mean, I remember it well enough to know it was not a good year. It was just one crisis after the other. You know, we'll go into that a little bit more. So the major goal of the Yippies was to go to Chicago and disrupt the 1968 convention where Humphrey would be nominated to run for president. And they played it for all it was worth. They had announced that they were going to have dancing bears there. They got a pig, which they named Pegasus, and they nominated it for president. So the Yippie candidate was Pegasus, and their goal was to nominate him and then eat him. Okay? Among the demands were to end the war in Vietnam, the legalization of all drugs, the abolition of money, the disarmament of police, and free love in the streets. Okay? And, I mean, the mainstream people took all this very seriously. They didn't understand the camp value of it or the satire or the way Hoffman and Rubin and the rest of these guys were spoofing American society. So all you heard about was drugs and sex. They're going to do it in the streets, and they're going to be stoned. And Hoffman and Rubin announced that they were going to lace the Chicago water supply with LSD, and they had this thing guarded for weeks. They had armed guards all over the place. The thought of Richard Daley on acid is just way too scary for all of us. So thank God they didn't do that, right? The media ate it up, and I mean, all you heard about was the Yippies, as if this was the movement. I mean, it was a tenth of a percent of the movement, but that's all you heard about. And Hoffman and Rubin were brilliant. They played it for all it was worth. Hoffman would wear like a shirt made of the American flag, and they did all kinds of crazy stuff with the pig and whatnot. And the media ate it up, and people loved it. It didn't reflect opposition to the war, though. The typical critic of the war was not Abbie Hoffman. It was probably some working class guy or some businessman, just some average Joe American, and maybe his wife and maybe his kids who just had some real reservations about the war. On college campuses, still a growing movement against the war. Why? Some people simply thought it was wrong. Others were getting close to being drafted themselves. There was a great deal of criticism of people like that. Well, you're only opposed to the war to save your own butt. And in many cases, that was true. I'm not sure that negates their opposition to it. That's, I guess, a philosophical question which everybody can thresh out on their own. Yeah, I think that was the case. Some people really got energized because they were 18 and they might have to be drafted. And so they took a stand against the war. I don't know if that was the reason for it or not. There's also other dynamics here, again, which I'll talk about later with regard to people's particular status or class. I mean, if you're at an elite university, you're probably not going to get drafted. I mean, the chances of you getting drafted are fairly slim. If you're a working class kid in the South or an African American, your chances of getting drafted and going to Vietnam are much, much higher. So there's a dynamic there as well. But clearly there's still a pretty significant movement on campuses against the war in Vietnam. So the Yippies were not typical, in fact. In Chicago, then, to kind of get to the meat of the issue, because this, in many ways, is probably the signal event of the anti-war movement. When, if you have to pick one image or picture of the anti-war movement, it's probably going to be Chicago in 1968. The Yippies, as I said, have built up for a long time. They're claiming that there are going to be hundreds of thousands of people protesting the war. There's an open call, come to Chicago. Okay, Graham Nash actually later wrote a song about it, which kind of lays it out there. Probably better than I could, and certainly a lot quicker. So I often tell students, instead of lecturing for an hour on liberalism, I should just play Phil Oakes, Love Me, I'm a Liberal, and you can get it much easier that way. Yeah.
Have you ever seen the movie Medium Cool?
Is that Haskell Wexler? Yeah. No, I
They have
haven't,
live
actually.
footage in Lincoln Park.
Yeah.
With the
No, it's great. It's like famous for that. It's Haskell Wexler's film about that. Yeah, I mean, they're calling 100,000 people are going to be there. They're in Grant Park. Yeah.
Is that live footage you're talking about of the 67 New York, April, New York?
No, this is 68 Chicago.
68 Chicago.
Yeah.
Oh, Lincoln Park.
Actually, it was Grant Park, wasn't it? I think it was Grant, not Lincoln.
I think it's Grant. Yeah.
I think it was Grant Park.
With the fountain in it, the big fountain.
Yeah. Yeah, because Lincoln's where the zoo is. Okay. Yeah. In the meantime, the government is aware of the Yippies' plans, so they begin to plant agents provocateurs in these various groups. And of course, if there is an infiltrator from the government, then almost without question, he's going to be the most radical person there. He's going to be the one who wants to, bring guns and do all kinds of stuff, and that's clearly the case. So in August, when the convention starts then, the Chicago police is ready. Everybody is on alert. They've infiltrated all the major groups, and in fact, these infiltrators are the people who are really provoking violence. One of them gets up and turns a flag upside down on a statue, and they start throwing stuff, and all of a sudden it gets real ugly. To tens of thousands of demonstrators there. The numbers never reach what the Yippies claim, which would be 100,000 are there. And they begin, which it begins as a fairly peaceful protest. A lot of Eugene McCarthy's people, McCarthy had run for president, had been defeated. He was an anti-war candidate. McCarthy's people are there protesting the war, but they're clearly not taking the same approach that the Yippies are. Late in August, the convention takes place. On August 25th, 150 police who have tear gas and nightsticks wade into an encampment in Grant Park and start bashing heads. The next day, the protesters strike back with rocks and bottles, and 5,000 Army troops are sent into Chicago. After that, local cops took off their badges and uniforms so they couldn't be identified and essentially went medieval. They had clubs, they had mace, and they went on a rampage. There are famous photos in Medium Cool and in other. I've never seen Medium Cool. I've seen like snippets of it where they'll show kids like getting pushed through windows of department stores and the police just bashing people on the head and bringing 75-year-old women and throwing them in paddy wagons and things like that. It comes to a head on the night that Humphrey's actually going to be nominated. Thousands of protesters marched onto convention headquarters at the Hilton, and police officers charge into the crowd, basically chanting "kill" and kill. It reminds me of Arlo Guthrie and Alice in the Restaurant. Shrink, I want to kill. See blood and guts and gore. Eat dead, burnt bodies. That's kind of what you see. The crowd in the famous scene starts chanting, "The whole world is watching." Quite powerfully, this is occurring at the same time the Soviet Union invades Czechoslovakia, and the world media transposes these scenes of cops beating kids in Chicago and the Soviet tanks rolling into Prague. And the unasked question is, what's the difference here, if there is any? Inside the convention, it becomes quite amazing. It's one of the more chilling scenes I've ever seen. Abraham Ribikoff is a senator from Connecticut, a liberal, and he stands up at the convention and he starts blasting the Chicago police, claiming they were using Gestapo tactics. Ribikoff, I'm not sure if he himself was a survivor of the concentration camps, but clearly members of his family were if he wasn't. And so when he talks about Gestapo tactics, that has a particular power to it. Daley, the mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, the kingmaker of Chicago, was sitting there, and he always denied saying this, but if you look at his mouth closely, it looks very much like he's saying, "Sit down, you fucking Jew." Okay? And so things get pretty ugly inside and outside. Outside, it's simply a riot. A commission to investigate this later would call it a police riot, incited by the local cops and the provocateurs. Inside, it's a mess. Humphrey's chances were doomed at that point. Whether he would have ever beaten Nixon is certainly open to question, but clearly after the debacle at Chicago, he didn't have a chance.
I have a couple of reflections on this, but first off, how did Humphrey wind up with the nomination? After Bobby Kennedy was killed, because between them, McCarthy and Kennedy were, Kennedy's delegates somehow got transferred to Humphrey, right? After he was killed, even though they were both, Kennedy entered as a peace candidate after seeing McCarthy's success. I mean, do you think that, was Kennedy there in the first place to co-opt McCarthy, who was like a genuine outside the Democratic political establishment?
Do you have another question, or do you want me to go with that one first?
Go with that one.
Okay. It's interesting because I think the general idea is if Kennedy hadn't been killed, he might have gotten a nomination. And in fact, I don't think that was the case. To kind of give a little bit of background on it. In late 1967, do this, do it now, do it later, what difference does it make? In late 1967, there was a liberal Democrat named Allard Lowenstein who didn't have any position, but he was kind of a deal maker, very influential liberal activist. And Lowenstein went around looking he started what was called a Dump Johnson campaign. And he went around looking for somebody to run against LBJ in the Democratic primaries because of Vietnam. And the first person he approached was Bobby Kennedy, who turned him down because he did not think that Johnson could be defeated. He thought it would be foolish, and the Kennedys don't take stupid risks like that. And Lowenstein went around. He finally talks to Eugene McCarthy from Minnesota, yeah. And McCarthy was clearly opposed to the war, but he never really had the kind of drive one would associate with somebody becoming president. McCarthy, if anything, was known for his wit. He's an incredibly clever guy. My favorite McCarthy joke was that for the Republican nomination that year, the contest was Nixon, Rockefeller, briefly, Reagan actually entered it, and George Romney, who was a governor from Michigan. And Romney started out as a supporter of the war, but then changed his mind and said, no, I'm against Vietnam. He said, I've been brainwashed. And McCarthy answered, well, a light rinse would have done. So this is why Eugene McCarthy was well known. But he decides to run. And he goes to New Hampshire, and a bunch of college students, and actually Vietnam veterans, VVAW, volunteer for the McCarthy campaign. And they all cleaned up. They cut their hair and they shaved their beards, and it was called Clean with Gene. And they went door to door. In the New Hampshire primary that year, which is the first one, McCarthy got 42% of the vote. Johnson actually won. He did not lose, which is often kind of the way it's presented. But for a sitting president to get only 58% of the vote against this insurgent is really quite telling. It's not unlike 1992 when Pat Buchanan scared the heck out of Bush and really, kind of set the tone for that campaign. And Bush never really recovered from that. So Johnson is already kind of, hit by that. Well, Bobby Kennedy saw this as a chance to exploit this. And Kennedy really had only come out against the war a little earlier. McCarthy had far better, you're right. McCarthy had far more legitimate anti-war credentials than Bobby Kennedy ever did. He had been a supporter of the war. I think, unlike many, Kennedy's transition was fairly genuine. Maybe I'm a dupe in that one, but I do think that he actually kind of got it in late 1967 and 1968. Once he saw that Johnson was vulnerable, he entered the race too, which of course infuriated Lowenstein and McCarthy. And Johnson, especially after the Tet Offensive, which is a total disaster politically and, I will argue later, militarily, Johnson pulls out of the race on March 31st. And so now you have McCarthy and Kennedy. And Kennedy and Humphrey at that point jumps into the contest. All right? Kennedy wins the majority of the primaries from that point on, including the big one in California, all right, and he is killed right after that. McCarthy essentially starts to fade, and Humphrey enters only a few primaries, and Kennedy head-to-head beats him, I think, almost every time. And in fact, McCarthy may have even won the Oregon primary. In terms of the actual votes received in primaries, Humphrey has the least, but it didn't matter, because at the time, and it's a little bit different today. In 1972, the Democratic reformed its nominating procedure. In 1968, most of the delegates were not elected in primaries, but were in fact appointed by the party, by labor unions, by Democratic Party bigwigs. I would argue that, in fact, Humphrey always had the nomination in his back pocket, had Kennedy survived or not. Because even though Kennedy had momentum and he had popularity, the party apparatus was solidly behind Hubert Humphrey. I remember a couple years ago I interviewed Lane Kirkland, who at the time was George Meany's second in command at the AFL-CIO, and Kirkland later ran the AFL-CIO for almost 20 years. And he said, we would just call people up. He'd say, we get on the phone and we'd call the Michigan delegation and say, we need so many delegates for Humphrey. We'd call Ohio. We had our people all over the place. He said it was taken care of. Kennedy never had a chance. Now, I think there is a possibility that given the public uproar over Kennedy, had he survived, it would have been harder to give Humphrey the nomination when, in fact, Kennedy was clearly more popular. But for Humphrey to get the nomination really was no surprise. The Democrats were clearly behind him. Johnson still controlled the party. Johnson had appointed all these people. Johnson had the labor union support, and they all just shifted to Hubert Humphrey when the time came. So the fact that he won isn't really surprising. Had Kennedy survived, it probably would have been something of a horse race. The one major difference, I think, was had Bobby Kennedy survived, you might not have seen the debacle at Chicago. And he was the only person who might have unified that party, who might have been able to prevent the kind of uproar and the kind of mess that actually occurred. But in terms of getting the nomination, the general line is had Kennedy survived, he would have gotten it. And that's nowhere near as certain as people would like it to be. And in fact, again, it's counterproductive, counterfactual, but I think Humphrey was sitting pretty. I don't think that the Democratic Party regulars were real worried about the 68 convention in terms of who would get the nomination. Yeah. Does that answer it? Yeah. Okay.
And then the irony that came out of that is that Nixon was able to present himself as the peace candidate.
Absolutely. The Democrats imploded. Nixon's a good politician. He was very clever. He worked it the correct way, right? And he comes out of this, looking like the sane voice of reason, right? Because the Democrats have just had this, family fight. I mean, this ugly fraternal battle. So, yeah, Nixon and Wallace benefit from all this,
I guess I was just gonna add a little bit of like personal experience.
Oh, that's great.
I was in high school when the 1968, and I think I sort of had a kind of a intuitive identification with like the emerging rock and roll subculture, but really wasn't politically astute in any way. But the experience of watching people who looked like me, only a couple of years older, get the crap kicked out of them by police overnight completely radicalized me.
Yeah.
And by 1 year later, I was getting kicked out of high school myself for anti-war protests, and it was active while I was in college. And I'm sure that thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of high school kids my same age had that same experience.
No, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, I've heard people say that before. That could be me, or parents. That could be my kid. I mean, Kent State, when we get to that,
it got even more when Kent State happened.
It can. I mean, that could be my kid just walking across campus. Yeah, absolutely. I think the movement, in a sense, after Chicago, and we'll talk about that later, because I want to stop at 68 and go talk about the war again. But after 68, the movement becomes far more large and diverse. Because many people, like you said, just average folks see that on TV and they're horrified by it. The war has come home. And, I mean, you don't have to be terribly brilliant to figure out that when the media is talking about Prague and Chicago at the same time, that there's a message there. That all the high-minded rhetoric about the land of democracy and whatnot seems fairly shallow or empty, doesn't it, when in fact you can juxtapose this communist bloc intervention with cops throwing kids through windows, right? So I think you're right, and I do think that that's far more widespread. I mean, people have started to do more work on the anti-war movement, and in fact, you start to see after 1968, after Chicago, a lot of mainstream people. I mean, one of the kind of great ironies, it's actually funny in some respects, is that most of Nixon's appointees, their kids were opposed to the war. I mean, the anti-war rallies, you'd have wives and children of the Secretary of Defense going to them. Spiro Agnew's 14-year-old daughter wanted to go to an anti-war rally in 1969, right? So it really does hit home, and I think the overkill in Chicago, I mean, the Chicago police still, I mean, the Democrats had their convention, was in 96 or 92? 96 in Chicago. And this was kind of, 1968, 1996, so they had a lot of media going back and replaying 68 and interviewing people. And I mean, basically, the folks in charge of Chicago just thought they did what they had to do. So they're still fairly secure with what they did. But outside of that, every commission that investigated it termed it a police riot, and most people who were there at the time said that the police just went way overboard. And in fact, those protesters, those yippies that actually started the rock and bottle throwing, for the most part were egged on or were in fact, government agents who had infiltrated the movement. So it's a terribly ugly scene. I.F. Stone, who's a radical journalist, a famous radical journalist, says, the war is destroying our country just as we are destroying Vietnam. Johnson, by that point, was really frayed and tired, and basically it's no surprise that he dies of a heart attack less than 5 years later. The war had taken its toll on him, and the events of 1968 did too. Every year, the president obviously gives a bunch of speeches and press conferences and whatnot, and at the end of every year the government collects all these, and they call it the public papers of the president. And so there's one volume for every president for every year. Press conferences, speeches, things like that, official stuff, not documents. And in 1968, and the president himself would write a little introduction to it. This is what happened that year. And I came across this in for the 1968 volume that LBJ wrote, and it was I thought it was terribly poignant. I mean, in his own way, LBJ is trying to kind of put his own slant on it, but at the same time, as I said, I thought it was quite poignant. He said, the American people recoiled in anguish in 1968 as violence again struck down national leaders and lit flames in the skies above a dozen cities. We confronted the perils of inflation at home and the danger of the dollar's decline abroad. The agony of an odious war forced upon us so cruelly for so long cut deep divisions across our national life. These, with all their shock and sorrow, are forever part of the fabric of this turbulent period. Coming from LBJ, I thought that was fairly, revealing. Of course, on one hand, he will call it an odious war, but then he will say, forced upon us so cruelly for so long. Obviously, he had no control over that. It was forced upon him, right? But even so, I thought it was fairly telling. So by 1968, the anti-war movement is clearly a reality, and it is having an impact on the war. How much of one? There's no answer to that. I mean, that's not something that be quantified or verified. Some people will argue that the anti-war movement was crucial in limiting America's ability to wage war, and that in the end, it forced Americans to cut and run from Vietnam or de-escalate the war in Vietnam, however you want to turn it. Others will say that the anti-war movement really was just disloyal. They were pro-communist, and they caused a great deal of trouble, but not terribly effective. They're all over the charts. I personally think that there were other factors more important than the anti-war movement, namely the Vietnamese. I mean, if you want to look for a reason the Americans lost, it wasn't. I mean, a lot of conservatives will say the Americans lost because they were sold out at home. They were stabbed in the back by all these yippies and hippies and drug users and Walter Cronkite and everything else. In fact, I think if I had to point to one reason why the Americans lost in Vietnam, it would be because of Vietnam. I mean, the war was in Vietnam, not in Washington or Chicago or New York. So I think to suggest the anti-war movement ended the war is really giving them too much credit. To suggest they had no impact is probably erroneous as well. And, you know, there are a lot of books on it. More and more research is being done on it, which reaches different conclusions. You know, obviously they made it harder. There's no question about that. I mean, if Johnson had ever thought of, for example, calling up the reserves or mobilizing the entire country and the economy for war, the anti-war movement would have been in the streets in even greater force than it was. So clearly his options were limited in that regard, but there were probably other factors limiting it as well. And you know, Wall Street, for example, opposed the war. And if Johnson's going to listen to somebody, is it going to be a protester in the street or, you know, a Wall Street banker? So there's just all kinds of factors at play to determine. So, you know, basically, there is no answer to the effectiveness. There's no single answer to the effectiveness of the movement. Its impact was huge. I think that's undeniable. But there's a difference between impact and effectiveness. And everybody knew about it. Millions of people participated in it. They saw it as a vital function of their role as citizens in a country that claimed to be a democracy. So there was no question that they had a huge impact. I mean, it was on the news. It enabled many people to feel like they were in a community when they spoke out against the war. Talking to one woman whose husband was in the Air Force at the time, and I forget where, they were living on a base, and she put a peace sign in the window and was terrified. And all of a sudden, peace signs started showing up in windows all over the base. And, you know, so the others there felt comfortable that somebody else felt the same way they did. And I think that's the vital role it played. Later on, when we talk about things like music and culture, you're going to see the same thing, where people will kind of have a particular touchstone, you know, Country Joe and the Fish or something like that, they have in common, so they can talk about that. Coffee houses on military bases and things like that. Yeah.
Is there a history course in this department that anyone deals specifically with that era of American history and the...
Yeah, that's mine.
Ah.
You're looking at it, yeah. I'm the 60s. Uh-huh. I'm the 60s guy.
Next semester?
No, I don't know when I'll do it again. I did it last fall, in fact. Yeah. Yeah.
Along those lines, does the CIA course that Dr. O'Brien teaches get into the CIA role in all this?
I don't know. In Vietnam? Probably not. Well, I mean, yeah, he does. I think he does touch on Vietnam. It'd be hard to because, as I said, the CIA technically still doesn't even admit to being in Vietnam. Although a couple years ago I was at the LBJ library and they were getting ready for an invasion of the CIA. The CIA was coming there to, I think, put everything on, scan everything in, and they're going to put it on CD-ROM. So even though they don't admit they were there, they are now processing the records, and at some point, hopefully in the future, this stuff will start to become more available. The CIA was there as something called the SOG, Special Operations Group. They're most closely identified with something we'll talk about later called Operation Phoenix, which was an assassination program. But clearly they were doing all kinds of other things there too that we don't know about.
That is one of the case studies that Dr. O'Brien has in that CIA course.
Phoenix?
Is Vietnam,
Okay.
you know, along with Guatemala and
Yeah, I'm sure he does, and I mean, we know stuff because there are agents who've written memoirs and things like that. In terms of the actual documentation, that's harder to come by because it hadn't been released yet. But yeah, I mean, yeah, the CIA was clearly involved.
That's one thing that's impressed me about this course. So much of the reading is so recent, 95 and later.
Yeah, and I mean, I mean, Vietnam wasn't that long ago. It was only, the war ended just not even 25 years ago, and I mean, the entire adult population remembers it intimately. So, for some time, I think you're still going to see this happening, more and more stuff coming out. And I mean, it's particularly emotional for that reason too. I mean, it's not like if I write about the Civil War, obviously, you want the North to win, right? But you don't have the same emotional attachment because you weren't there. Whereas if you're writing about Vietnam, you can, you can write with some passion, and you'll see a lot of that in like in the selections we've read and in other places. On both sides. I mean, there are people who defend the war now terribly passionately, just as people oppose it in those terms. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry, forgive me.
Why?
I can't help it, it's my mouth. It's funny well, specifically this course, as we move through this course, and you think back at what was going on, for instance, Jane Fonda, going to North Vietnam and standing there proclaiming, how just, the North Vietnamese were, and how at the time, it was just, she was a demon from hell. But now as we look at the history, and have a perhaps a more objective view based on what we're reading, and having also put some distance between that era and now, it's just interesting, to feel the difference, to think about the differences, and for it to be so different here in 1999 than it was in 69 and 67 for us, experiencing this history we're talking about.
Yeah. Fonda's interesting, and you notice I don't mention her because I think she just gets way more attention than she deserves. I mean, it's an actress. She's an actress, all right? But it's interesting, even at the time, a lot of Americans went to North Vietnam, and they were treated, the response they got was kind of engendered by the way they were perceived, and Fonda was perceived as Barbarella. So she goes there and she's trying to talk politics, and no one takes her terribly serious to begin with. She also essentially makes a statement of support for the Vietnamese and has her photo taken sitting in an anti-aircraft pit, theoretically, shooting down American planes. That's kind of the image conveyed. Obviously, she's not doing that. Herbert Aptheker, a communist historian, Tom Hayden, and Stott and Lynn also went to Vietnam. And they came home and they were hassled as communists. Joan Baez went to North Vietnam. She's a Quaker. She condemned all sides and condemned war as a pacifist while in North Vietnam. And didn't really catch much flack for it, although Al Capp created a character called Joni Phoney, which was clearly modeled on Joan Baez in Little Abner. Capp was a well-known right-winger. But Joan Baez got nowhere near the flack, and in fact was generally accepted. I mean, she was a folk singer, and no one took her terribly, not like she was considered an intellectual, but by and large, she still had integrity, whereas Fonda, became vilified as all evil. And I mean, Fonda was an actress. I never could quite understand. I realized the symbolic importance, especially if you're in favor of the war. But Baez got none of that, and Aptheker and Lind and Hayden got some of it, but not as much. King, who comes out against the war, gets a lot of flack for it, but again, Fonda was a lightning rod. I mean, an incredible lightning rod. Terribly symbolic. Even now, I still get stuff all the time over the internet and the web about Jane Fonda. Veterans groups still, protest her appearances and whatnot. And I mean, she's still a lightning rod for that. And it's real interesting. I don't like to touch it because I just think that she's getting way more attention than she needs. It's just, she was one individual who happened to use her celebrity for that reason. Yeah.
Was she responsible for any POW being possibly killed?
I think more likely these people were responsible for bringing POWs home. Only one POW was killed. It was a guy who tried to escape. That was the only American POW killed in captivity. Two guys tried to escape one night, and they were caught, and one of them was tortured to death that night. The other one, I believe, survived it. Yeah. So, I mean, in fact, the Vietnamese often would make a show for PR purposes of sending POWs home. In fact, Lind, Aptheker, and Hayden brought one or two home, I believe. And I think they were African Americans too, because it's just like the Iranians did when they took hostages. It was a way to kind of try to appeal to black Americans who had their own issues with the U.S. government, which is what we're going to talk about next, saying, hey, look, we don't blame you. You guys are oppressed by the system just like we are. So I I mean, to claim that Jane Fonda in any way had Americans killed, I think is a, you can't prove that, and it's just, I just think it's, it's just, yeah, I mean, I don't know how to respond to that, you know. Lyndon Johnson had Americans killed. He was the one giving the orders, you know, or whoever, but, you know, Fonda was, you know, I don't know. It's just difficult for me to talk about that because I have my own opinions on it, and I don't want to throw I mean, that's just my opinion, which is no more valid than anybody else's. And you can understand, you know, if you're a veteran, how her image would piss you off. There's no question about it. This is a woman has her picture taken supporting the enemy. I can totally understand that. But, you know, to blame her for the war, blame her for losing the war somehow is, I think, is a little bit beyond where we need to go. And it's a diversion from things which are, I think, far more important. Okay, but that's basically my own take on things, and it's not based on anything other than my own thoughts, not empirical research. I mean, who knows? We may someday see a direct link, and Fonda might be, you know, the most important character in this whole thing, but I kind of doubt it. What do I know? Hey, in many people's estimations, it's Walter Cronkite. I'll talk about Ted. I mean, there are people. Peter Braystrup, a journalism professor, wrote 2 volumes on Cronkite, basically. Cronkite just gets vilified. There are people today who, you know, this guy was part of the liberal conspiracy to end the war. So, you know, I guess you find your enemies wherever. I want to shift gears now and talk about the war at home, which is very important to me. In fact, give you a little more than you probably want to hear of my own personal academic background or intellectual background on this. A couple years ago, some of you familiar, we're reading Masters of War, which is a book I wrote, my first one, back in 1996. And I know this sounds arrogant, so please forgive me for being immodest for a couple minutes here. And I was asked to do another book on Vietnam. And I said I would only do it if I could do it on more than just the war, but talk about the 60s. Because to talk about Vietnam without that context, to me, was kind of pointless. If you're doing a specific monograph like my first book, then yeah, you focus on something like I did, military, Vietnam, so on. But if you're going to do a general book, which you want a lot of people, including freshman students and survey courses, to read, then to do Vietnam by itself without the larger context, to me, wasn't going to teach them what I would like them to know, or what I would hope that they would be interested in knowing, which was about that entire period. So when I produced this book, Vietnam and the Transformation of American Life, it actually had 2 parts to it. And the first part is basically a straight history of the war, and with some the anti-war movement thrown into it. And it has my own particular take on it. It's probably not the most original thing. I mean, there's nothing in there that I discovered on my own or was the first person to ever come up with. The second part is about the movements. And my major point, which is what I've already been sharing with you, is that the war fundamentally transforms everything else that's going on. And so I link the two. And I think that's important, because to do Vietnam without talking about the other things that are going on really gives you an incomplete sense. And it kind of takes Vietnam out of context. I mean, without the Great Society, without the New Left, without civil rights, without a counterculture, Vietnam doesn't make the same sense that it does with it. All right? You can't pull that out. You can't compartmentalize things. LBJ didn't have 3 or 4 different brains, one for Vietnam, one for civil rights, one for Great Society. He had one, and it's not like a cream separator where you can take things out and separate them. When you have crises confronting you, you see them all. They're part of the same process. So Martin Luther King in Vietnam, you can't shut down your brain and say, okay, I've thought about Vietnam, now I'm going to think about King. These things all come together. And so to deal with the war without taking this into account, I think is an error. That's why I teach a course on the 1960s separate from this. Right? In this course, we've definitely focused in fairly good detail on Vietnam. And of course on the 60s, you can't do the 60s without the war either, can you? So, but I spent a lot less time on Vietnam and a lot more on this other stuff. But to do this class without touching on this, I think would be just as bad, just as wrong as doing the 60s without Vietnam. They're part of the same process, okay? They are, 2 halves of the same walnut, the yin and the yang. Use any kind of silly metaphor you want, all right? I want to start by talking about what there were 2 major movements going on simultaneous with the war. And I've just reversed the order chronologically in which they occurred. The first, of course, is civil rights. But I actually want to talk about that second. The other is Johnson's attempt to create a great society at home. The Great Society is part of the overall liberal mission of that period. In 1961, there is a scholar who's actually a socialist named Michael Harrington, who writes a book called The Other America, 1962 actually. And in this book, The Other America, Harrington does research and finds that there are about 40 million Americans, almost a quarter, almost 25% of the country, who can be classified as poor, according to government statistics. And poverty statistics don't leave a lot of wiggle room. I mean, if you are, you know, the number, the amount of money you have to make to be considered poor is actually very low. And so there are many people who are, even though above the poverty line, in real terms are really poor, who really can't make it. So Harrington finds 40 million Americans actually poor, about a quarter of the country. And this shocks America. Reminds me of a great line by Gil Scott-Heron, America leads the world in shock. So, oh my God, there's poor people, there are hungry people out there. They're not eating, they're kids who don't have health care. You know, it shocks Americans, especially good liberals like John F. Kennedy and later Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy had read Harrington's book, and the depth of poverty and need really took these people by surprise, because they didn't believe that this wealthy and powerful country could have these kinds of social problems. And because of this, they will create social policy with the goal of trying to address and correct the kind of issues and the kind of situations that Harrington had exposed. Now, Kennedy and then Johnson have power at a unique time, even though in 1990s the United States is clearly the world's greatest power. There's no question about that. In the early 1960s, the United States probably was even more powerful in relation to the rest of the world than it is today. The U.S. was still riding this incredible wave of post-war growth. As I said, after World War II, the United States, in the early years of after World War II, controlled 50% of the world's trade. I mean, think about that. 1 out of every $2 in trade was American. That's staggering level of world power and hegemony. It goes down in the 50s to 25%. That's still huge. Yeah.
What's the window, the time window on that 50% control, roughly?
I'd say 45 to the early 50s. Maybe through Korea, because obviously in Korea you have a great deal going on. By the late 50s, it's still 25%. Now, this is a country, remember, which has 6% of the world's population, uses 25% of the world's resources, and controls 25% of the world's trade. Has military commitments globally, has bases in 30 or 40 different countries. You are talking about a major superpower. I was talking to somebody from the Netherlands not long ago who used the term hyperpower, which would have fit if they had had it at that time. So clearly then the United States is flush with money, with success, with power, and with this sense of mission. Remember Kennedy's inaugural address, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So, I mean, thousands of young Americans joined the Peace Corps, joined the military, riding this crest of Kennedy's service, this whole Camelot persona, he and his beautiful young wife and their perfect, beautiful little family, really create this incredible aura that anything is possible. The country is incredibly wealthy. They have the commitment, so we can take on anything and we can do it. Yeah.
In 1963, the Peace Corps had their own dormitory at Texas Tech.
Oh, the numbers are staggering. I mean, just people flock to that because look at the way Kennedy presents that. It's our particular mission to go into these poor countries and bring them the blessings of liberty. I mean, Rudyard Kipling earlier in the century talked about the white man's burden. That's what the Peace Corps was, right? I mean, the unspoken thing behind the Peace Corps was this is also a way for the United States to kind of create societies where American capital can come in and American businesses will feel quite comfortable. So it's basically reform in the sake, it's kind of an old progressive idea. We reform a country before we actually go in there and
Pacification.
well, it is in a sense, it's a social form of pacification. It's not wartime pacification, but we have to go in and educate them and teach them basic functions because so long as they live in incredible rural, dirt poor poverty, they can't buy, all the toaster ovens we make. So that sounds cynical, but that's quite clear. I mean, that's no conspiracy. That's the way they thought. And, you do good, but you also want to do well. So you send the missionary, instead of the missionaries, you send the Peace Corps in, right? And it's a secular version of missionaries in China. You send missionaries in China to teach these Chinese to be more like us so they can buy oil lamps and Coca-Cola and stuff like that. But Kennedy obviously doesn't present it that way, and so the Peace Corps becomes very popular. If you've ever seen Born on the 4th of July, or you've read the book, at the very beginning, Ron Kovic is inspired, Tom Cruise character is inspired by Kennedy's inaugural address and joins the service. And I've talked to countless numbers of people who had the same thing. I mean, if you've ever heard the speech, it's incredible rhetoric. It really is very powerful stuff. I mean, he was a wonderful speaker, and, it was beautiful imagery. Yeah.
Sorry. Testing. Who wrote it?
Ted Sorensen
Sorensen.
did most of it. Yeah, Sorensen was Kennedy's #1. Sorensen also wrote Kennedy's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, along with Georgetown professor Jules David, Profiles in Courage. David and Sorensen wrote it. Sorensen probably wrote Kennedy's first grade spelling paper, But at any rate, I mean, it's beautiful rhetoric, and you can understand the sense of optimism and the sense of limitless possibilities. But war and poverty, hell yeah. I mean, we'll knock it out like that. Vietnam, take care of it like that. Why not? I mean, in a sense, Vietnam makes perfect sense. Why wouldn't they think the way they did? Yeah.
And going to the moon.
Oh, absolutely. It's a perfect example of that. We shall go to the moon in this decade or the next, the last frontier, right? The next frontier, I mean, that's space, Star Trek. Oh yeah, the moon is a perfect example. NASA, that's Kennedy's baby. There's nothing we can't do, right? It's Camelot all over again, that mythical, magical kingdom, right? So, 1961, 1962, Harrington's talking about poverty, we'll take care of it. This Ho Chi Minh guy's making problems in Vietnam, we'll take care of him. Moon, not a problem, right? Healthcare, we'll take care of it. We'll wipe out all these diseases and except for putting the Cubs in the World Series, there ain't nothing we can't do, okay? I like you guys, because my survey course never laughs at my jokes, because they don't get them. But you're a hip crowd, so, yeah. I'll be opening for Puff Daddy next week, so. So what does Kennedy do? He assumes that with enough money and simply enough will, that anything can be accomplished. So he proposes an increase in minimum wage laws. It's just a series of things that Kennedy does. Proposes increases in federal money toward education. At the time, the federal government actually spent a fair amount of money on education. Now, in the 1990s, there's been a real retrenchment. And the federal government spends 7%, I think, of education monies actually come from D.C. It could be, it's somewhere in that area. It used to be about a third. There used to be kind of a three-third equation. A third from the federal government, a third from states, a third from locals, and now it's all state and local, basically. So Kennedy actually wants to increase the federal government's role in getting educational monies to districts where they're most needed. So he proposes increases in that. Expansion of Social Security benefits for the elderly and disabled. Proposes a housing program for the poor. There had never really been any commitment at all to housing poor people. This is kind of where you eventually get HUD and urban renewal. Kennedy himself doesn't really see much of this through. Congress at the time did not share Kennedy's vision and willingness to spend money on these things. So Kennedy himself really, in terms of getting a domestic program, doesn't do much, doesn't accomplish much. I mean, again, the later image of Kennedy after he's assassinated doesn't fit in with the reality, which really had a fairly limited number of successful programs you could point to. I mean, he had ideas, let's do this, let's do that. But in terms of actually getting anything done, not a whole lot was accomplished. In fact, let's say, for example, a minimum wage law is passed, but people like migrant farm workers and waiters and waitresses are exempt from it. So the people who needed it most are actually exempt from Kennedy's minimum wage increase. Congress refuses to fund a public works program. Kennedy wanted to create summer jobs programs, things like that for kids. Congress refused to go along. He had a program he proposed for aid to migrant farmers. Congress wouldn't go for that. Public transportation increases and so forth. So by the time he's assassinated in November of '63, his record is ambivalent at best, and I would argue really not terribly impressive at all. I mean, in terms of actual accomplishments, not a whole lot there. Great substance, great charm. The whole thing, he had style, charisma, he was slick. Marilyn Monroe singing at the birthday, all that kind of thing. So, it was good times, it was high times. He was very, very popular, but in terms of substance, it's not a whole lot there. It was a triumph of style over substance for the most part. LBJ does a lot more. And in terms of actually getting stuff done, whether you agree with it or think it was useful or not is another question, but in terms of actually getting stuff done, LBJ and FDR are head and shoulders above everybody. And in terms of actual legislative accomplishments, Johnson was also driven in a different direction than Kennedy. Kennedy, remember, comes from the lap of luxury. He's from a very well-to-do family, a very powerfully and politically connected family. Johnson is from rural Texas. He goes to, what was it called at the time, Southwest Texas Teachers College? It's now Southwestern State, Southwest Texas State, is that it? San Marcos. He did not have the same background. His father apparently was well respected, or at least LBJ claims. And you know, with LBJ, you always have to take everything with a grain of salt. Everybody tends to create a mythic past, and there's no question he did that. He worked his way through college. He worked with poor minority kids as a school teacher. Because of this background, which he probably exaggerated, he claimed to have a real affinity for the less privileged. And he was a big supporter of the New Deal. He was elected to Congress basically saying, I'm going to go there and I'm going to support FDR and the New Deal. Actually, was he elected in 44 for the first time or 46? I can't remember. I mean, whether FDR himself may have been dead, but he clearly still was in that vein, that reform New Deal vein. In 1964, during his first State of the Union address, he declares an unconditional war on poverty. Right? His goal is to create a great society. What is a great society? A society free from want, a society free from poverty, where children are immunized and educated, and you know, all the basic touch point issues, jobs and wages and things like that. And Johnson, for a short time, actually seems to be able to pull this off. In 1964 and 65, you see a real burst of legislation. The Office of Economic Opportunity is created, which will create programs like Head Start to provide, you know, school breakfasts and funding for young children. You know, studies had always shown that kids, you know, the earlier you get to them and start to educate them and give them proper nutrition, they're gonna do better. So he creates Head Start as part of the Office of Economic Opportunity, which is headed by Sergeant Shriver, Kennedy's brother-in-law. It would prepare people for jobs. It would train the unskilled, job training programs, things like that. It would have night school classes so people could get a high school education or a GED or something like that. It created a group called VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America, which was considered a domestic Peace Corps, where people would join VISTA, and instead of being sent to Borneo like Kinky Friedman was, they might go to an Indian reservation and work with children there, or go to a rural town in the South or something like that, whatever. So this is all part of OEO. It would help train teachers. It would help train doctors and nurses for rural health programs. It would provide small loans to people in underdeveloped areas and so forth. Provide skills and education and jobs for poor kids. Prepare them for school, provide them with a school breakfast or a hot lunch or something like that, and maybe in the long run give them some self-esteem and dignity. And 1964-65, the first couple of years, these types of things seem to be working. In 65, probably the two benchmark acts of the Great Society are passed, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which provides a fairly significant amount of federal funding for American education. In America's largest cities in 1963, and the number really, 64, number quite surprising to me, dropout rates were at 60% and higher, which is about where they are now in major cities, New York, Washington, D.C., Detroit, Chicago, L.A., places like that, maybe Houston, I don't know. Very significant dropout rates. I was surprised at how high they were in 1964. And so Johnson pointed out, as he said very colloquially, the kids is where the money ain't. So the basic idea, not necessarily the way it was carried out, but the idea was to get money to those school districts that needed it the most, all right? And Johnson, as he signs the bill, says, as the son of a tenant farmer, I know that education is the only valid passport from poverty. It doesn't quite work out the way the rhetoric would have indicated. Under the Act, federal government money was supposed to have been sent to districts mostly where family incomes were very low. The money was intended to go to the poorest districts. In order to appease the Catholic Church, which was lobbying against the bill, Johnson also made available aid to Catholic school students, not the schools themselves. So if a student in a Catholic school was very poor, then he or she might be eligible for federal aid. The school itself could not get federal government money, and this was a concession made so that the Catholics wouldn't kill the bill. Johnson in the Elementary and Secondary School Act then is supposed to give money to the poor school districts, provide money to schools for language and reading training, for maybe teaching English language programs to migrant workers, audiovisual equipment, specialized ed for preschool kids, nurses in the schools, school counselors, bilingual teachers, special ed classes, GED classes for adults. All of these things are supposed to attack America's education emergency, and these are perfectly consistent with the liberal mission to, you know, uplift and reform the country because we can afford it. We're big enough, we're powerful enough, and dadgummit, people like us, so let's do it, okay? So this is part of the Johnson agenda. The other one, which we'll pick up in a minute right after that red light goes off and we have a break, go to the fridge, get a sandwich, a beer, whatever, is the Medicare and Medicaid Act, where they deal with the health crisis. So we shall talk about those after this, as Alfred Hitchcock would say, after this commercial message from our sponsors, whatever.